Meredith Thatcher.
Well, thanks very much for coming along, and thanks for the kind introduction. First, some housekeeping. You'll see there are 3 documents on the handout. The first is a checklist for your own use on how to assess the quality of an index. The second is a 10-step process that I use to create an index. And the third document focuses on the Digital Trends Task Force and EPUB. Today I'm asking the question, is an ebook index worth the e-paper it's written on? As I create indexes, you can guess my answer and the direction the presentation's heading. But first, I guess I'd like to know what you think makes an effective index now, or put more simply, what you'd like to see in an index. So throw some ideas out there about what you think an index should have. Keywords? Any other?
I think a key is
what it does, because a key issue of an index is obviously trying to find out where you're going from a term, go back to a page and make sure that what you've looked up in the index is actually on the page. So there's a lot of consistency issues there, and also that raises another issue about combining indexes by books from a single author, which I'm going to also mention. Yes? Easy usability. That's really important because as books have moved into the e-world, the type of index has been compressed. Whereas you used to have indexes that were in itemised list form, you've now got them in a combined paragraph form divided by semicolons, which can make reading quite difficult. And I'll also mention about how e-indexes work in an e-environment and what the new trends are. So basically it shows that people like us, depends on the person and the type of index they're reviewing, and most importantly, who the audience will be. So I guess I will start up. So when we are young, we think life will be a straight line. We won't deviate from that line, and the years will turn as pages to propel us forward. Then we discover that life with its twists and turns is anything but a straight line, and that we have memories of people, places and times that we selectively draw out. A book is the same. We would like to think we will read a book from start to end, moving through the chapters, and like life, hopefully learning something along the way. And like memory, that book's index is one way we can selectively draw out those people, places and times. The entries in the indexes are pointers to information in the main text. So, as Dr. Samuel Johnson said, knowledge is of 2 kinds. We know a subject ourselves, or we know where we can find information on it. So as we take a book off a shelf, we need to ask, like memory, how will we access its information? So I guess with a show of hands, who here today reads the end of a book first? Does anyone? Does anyone read the end of a novel first? Okay, it's interesting. Psychological exam. The different it's a different way of approaching, and factors play a part. For example, the time we've got available to access information. So if you've got to go to something quickly, you might go to the end first. Well, I'm going to be the odd one out because I actually read the end of a book first for 2 reasons. After reading the end, I like to go back and work through the book to get an understanding of the way the author thinks and how they arrange information. But basically, mainly I read the end first because when I was young, I checked a book out of the local library and read it to the end, well, nearly, because I got almost to the end, and what did I find? Sort of horror of horror, 2 pages missing. So I would have loved the way it had ended if they'd have been there. Mind you, given our capacity to invent and to imagine, I simply created my own ending. So I guess you're about to join me on a journey through time to the future of indexing in an e-world. Let's travel back to before 1450. In the pre-Gutenberg press landscape, you would find few indexes. Instead, you would see papyrus scrolls with no leaf or page numbers and no line counts. The index was a slip attached to the scroll with the title of the work and sometimes the author's name. And using this slip, you could identify a scroll without pulling it off the shelf. So imagine a technical document of today on a scroll without page numbers. Where would you start? And even with numerical signposts, how would you refer to an index when you had to unroll the scroll to the very end to find the part you were searching for before rolling it back up again? Most impractical. So even later indexes were found mainly in classical texts scribed by scholars, with the index at chapter or paragraph level rather than at line level. Gutenberg changed the printing landscape. So you fast forward your travels to a century or two after 1450, and you will see many copies of the books. Yet indexes were different from today. Most were listed by the first letter of the first word, with the rest of the letters being in no particular order. So ministry might come before or after masonry, or the index would be made up of alphabetical index tables at the end of the book. Fast forward another century and you'd see index entries by the first syllable, with the rest of the entry unordered. So misinterpret might come before or after misdiagnose. But by the 18th century, most indexes were in a format you would recognise today, and that's the way it's been, pretty much, until now. Now the printing landscape is changing again, and the indexing landscape needs to change with it. So what's use as an index today? Well, we pretty much use an index of a book to quickly find the page number or locator to a person, a place, or a concept. Indexing is a mix of art and craft, and we have to be inventive, especially as we use new technologies to broaden the way we access information. So let's first look at the 4 types of a book index, which is my focus today. I'm not particularly focused on database indexing, although that is the most prevalent form of indexing in New Zealand. But basically most freelance indexers use back of book indexing. So there's 4 types of book index. There's a light, average, scholarly, and exhaustive. So let's go to type 1. That's a light index, where you index 1 to 3 terms from each page in the main text. So in what type of book would you expect to find it? Well, you'd think it would be a pretty simple type of book, but in actual fact, the answer might surprise you. That's the first page of the index to Absolutely Small, How Quantum Theory Explains Our Everyday World by Michael Fayer. So you might find a light index in any type of book. We get some topics that the author covers, but see no sub-entries, and few page numbers, which we call locators in the indexing world. Still, those locators show full page ranges. So you've got 153 to 154 under atomic orbitals. So it's a full 3-digit spread. As of basically early this morning, Absolutely Small is available on Kindle for $14.16, which includes the free international wireless delivery via Amazon, Whispernet. The Kindle version does have an index, but most of these indexes offer little beyond a find function. And I put my iPad along because I actually bought a book off Amazon on biometrics, verification in biometric systems, and it basically is a complete PDF, and that's all it is. It basically has no links, nothing at the back. You just look at it, and it's great in the contents. It links you to the index, but when you go to the index, it doesn't take you anywhere else. So it's not the best. The book was published a while back, so the hardback, you remember $14.16 for the Kindle version, is only $16.39. And there's even a complete audio version for $23.95, which you can trial for free for 30 days. Okay. Type 2, so I've redrawn these, is an average index, where we index 4 to 5 terms from each page in the main index. These are index entries from The Bit and the Pendulum by Tom Siegfried. So you see sub-entries listed alphabetically and separately below each entry. The locator ranges are also shorter. So you've got 179 to 80. So it's a 3 to 2 range. So, and the commas, that index has actually put commas after the entries before the start of the locators. That's another difference. And you'll see that that they've also indexed note number 3 for page 257. There's different ways of indexing notes, and there's a big debate over whether you should actually index notes or plates and maps, figures, or not. So that's another one. Basically, that is available on Kindle for $8.56. and there are hardback and paperback versions for not much more. Okay, type 3 is a scholarly index, which is indexing 6 to 9 terms for each page in the main index. These are entries for an index I created for the book that Emma mentioned, Invaluable Service, a book about signals intelligence in New Zealand that I co-wrote. It has more detail than the average index, but still lists the entries in the traditional way. The index also uses, you'll see there, actually has C references. So you've got C plate, also plate 13, which is a way of cross-referencing and indexing C, C also, C under. So that's another one that's there. Basically, it's available in print on demand from the publisher, and the price point's actually over $70, in case you work on a copy, because of the length of the book and the number of the photos and maps in it. It's a fairly long book. This is type 4. This is an exhaustive index, and it looks horrible, but we see indexed 10 to 15 terms from each page in the main text, and that's an index page from Korolev, How One Man Masterminded the Soviet Drive to Beat America to the Moon. So you can tell what type of private library I have for all of these, by James Harford. The book's only available in hardback or paperback, and the hardback sells for more than $80. The book runs one sub-entry on from the next, separated by semicolons. So the entry looks like a paragraph. So it's quite complex, but the format saves space and therefore money, so you'll see it more often. So basically, how do we create an index when we don't know how people will access it and what they'll use the index for? There are 4 parts to the answer, actually. Index as if your reader is present, index to a plan, index the parts, not the whole, and index to a deadline. So you'll see in a minute why I've got that there. Index as if your reader is present, and ask these questions. Does my index meet the needs of not just the author but the reader? Will the reader understand what I've written? Have I indexed all I need to, and does my index reflect the text? The next one is index to a plan. So you have to set your schedule and stick with it. And it's difficult because indexing always comes at the end of the publishing process. But all books cost money, even ebooks. The days of an index taking up a quarter of the book's length are gone though. So you can shorten an index instead of eliminating it entirely. You can use narrower margins, smaller type, shorter indents, or a different number of columns. I've actually seen indexes that have got one page, one column, double column, and even a book on MI5 that has 3 columns in the index, which is very difficult to read, actually. And it's an exhaustive index. So you can also conflate locator spans where the numbers read 136 to 7 instead of 136 to 37. Reduce the size of the drop, which is the blank space on the first page of the index. Create a combined glossary and index, which you're seeing more and more these days, and I'll come to that. It's called a glindex. Or separate a single index for more than one for books, more than one book by the same author. So the next one, to keep an index at a sensible length, you need to index the parts, not the whole. The reader doesn't want to read the book twice. I've seen it was actually a biography by Baudelaire, which had an entry about the life of the person, but it was actually ran to 4 pages, and it was like a précis. If you didn't want to read the book, you could have read this entry in the index to get Baudelaire's life, which is terrible. I mean, a timeline in the book would have been more preferable. So know what you will include and what you won't. And if you can't decide on whether or not to include an entry, check with the author or the editor. Sometimes those positions are the same, and as Neil James said this morning, they're converging, which I'll come back to later. So at the bottom line, if you like, you always index to a deadline. Timelines are always tighter at the end of the publication process, and the index is always near that tail end. Now you're probably wondering why you've got Dr. Seuss's Sneetches sitting there. Well, basically I've shown you a range of technical indexes, but believe it or not, indexing nursery rhymes and short stories is an excellent way to learn how to index or to see how one works, because many words are introduced in a few short pages. So you've got this obvious one, which some of you will know. When the star belly children went out to play ball, could a plain belly get in the game? Not at all. You could only play if your bellies had stars, and the plain belly children had none upon theirs. When the star belly sneetches had frankfurter roasts, or picnics or parties or marshmallow toasts, they never invited the plain belly sneetches. They left them out in the cold, in the dark of the beaches. They kept them away, never let them come near, and that's how they treated them year after year. So there's a lot of new words that he was fantastic at doing that, introducing into the language for children to learn. And so you might think, well, what terms might you index from these verses? Believe it or not, I've highlighted them there. There's star belly children, of course, as distinct from plain belly children. There's ball, there's stars, there's frankfurter roast, there's picnics, parties, marshmallow toasts, etc., beaches. And the interesting one, though, is the final one, which is more like a concept. And in indexes, always index concepts such as how to treat. So in this case, it's how to treat them year after year. So it's quite a different way of thinking about things. For indexes, like technical communicators, the devil is in the detail. So here's a list of index entries. If you think that indexing is quite simple, I'm about to dissuade you from that. All but 3 have a mistake. So that I've created. So under computer, use the plural if there's more than one item of the same type noted. You'll go to an index and often you'll see a singular word, which might make you think that it's only mentioned once in the entire document or book. Headlines, there's no errors in that one. Illustrations does have, of course, it's got a spelling error. And as we're all technical people, we can see the triple L. Imagination, and basically it's inconsistent style for page numbers. So you can see you've got a 3-1, which is becoming increasingly common that you'll see, and the less common was the 3-3. The International Monetary Fund has a spelling, basically has a spelling error in that for the page range, and that comes up a lot, where a 0 replaces an N dash, which is also going out of fashion. And then you've got, basically, I put John Key in there, use of comma and 1 space before the page, which is inconsistent with the rest of the index, so you've actually got a comma. Linley Dodd should be Dodd, comma, Linley, under D, so it's actually been misfiled. Hyperlinks, of course, should basically come before illustrations. In microprocessors, there's a comma missing between the last 2 page numbers, and that often creeps in. Photographs, there's basically no errors in that. Pie charts, the page numbers are out of order, so you've basically, it's quite interesting. There's 38, of course, coming before 36. I'll mention a little bit about indexing software and how that can rectify those sorts of issues later on. Puzzles, there's no error in that. Victoria University of Wellington, of course, it needs a capital for the word Wellington. Warranties is an inconsistent use of hyphen and the N dash. And Wellington Institute of Technology, it should have initial caps for W, I and T. So you can see you need to have an eye for detail when creating or checking an index. And good things take time, and in my opinion, an index is actually quite a good thing that's meant to last. So I'm going to look at the bigger picture, for which I use ACCC, which has nothing to do with any organisation, and basically accessibility. So is my index easily accessible? Will the reader be able to find all the book's major topics easily from the index? Those are critical. Are all the index entries listed in a recognisable, searchable order? And you'd be surprised how often that creeps up. Are all relevant concepts indexed and similar concepts brought together? So that's all under accessibility. Basically, you want to make sure that your reader can get to your information quickly. The next one is clarity. So will the reader understand my entries? Does my format support readability? And that's increasingly the case as we read books in all sorts of different formats. Are all my sub-entries clear and readable? And have I included prepositions and linking words. Sometimes you'll see those in an index where you'll have the name of the person and then underneath it'll have in and a location or of. So you just need to make sure that those are included and make sense from the lead-in entry, the main entry. Consistency. Have I included cross-references for synonyms and variations of the same term? And do my cross-references actually lead to real entries? There's nothing worse than going for one index entry to another entry spot and finding nothing there. So, for instance, if you cross-reference Burma to Myanmar, or vice versa, you need to check the entries are both there. I've come across numerous books where that's not the case. Are my page numbers or locators accurate and complete? So how many times have you gone to find a name in the main text using the index as your guide and found the name isn't there, or indeed actually the page number's incorrect and you've looked up the page number and no one's actually done a check? So underscoring all of that is comprehension. So you must always make sure that your index makes sense. So on the handout I've given you, one of them, is the 10 steps that I use to create an index. That's the second one. Basically, I receive the page proof, and if you read through that, you'll see how I get to step 10, which is actually proofreading the page proofs of the index after the typeset stage. So just to prove there's sort of, as you're reading through that, I'll leave you for a little minute. So you can see that it's not a one-step process. And also, like I say, there's no shortcuts. And for that, I'm actually going to offer you a couple of cautionary tales that have happened to me in my career, both of which could have been very expensive, but didn't turn out to be, as I'll explain. The first tale is a book I edited on China's new diplomacy. I emailed the text to the publisher, who packaged the book to a subsidiary. That subsidiary was going to do some steps in the publication process. Unfortunately, they sent an earlier version to the typesetter. So luckily I kept the paper trail that confirmed they'd received the correct version. That's the first thing you need to do. The book was published in hardback, and the publisher didn't send us a sample copy at first. They actually did, however, send it out to various libraries across the United States. When I finally saw the copy and went to the index, next to many of the entries, I found my draft text in square brackets because it had gone to various different authors. It had 6 different authors, and they weren't all, this was an Australian text, but the contributors, most of them were Chinese diplomats. And there was my text update at page proof stage, still sitting in the index. Further, the final chapter was like a wrap-up of chapters, so it actually contained references to the index and at various pages in the book, so that was also incorrect. And indeed, some of the wording was incorrect in the main text. It went out, we got it back. The next day, we got a call from a very irate Chinese diplomat who said, had we actually seen it? And I'd actually just gone through it, and believe it or not, it was actually the cover, which I'm going to come to as another aspect, that actually drew me to the mistakes. And it was absolutely terrible because it cost the publisher thousands of dollars because we automatically said, stop delivering it, do a recall, do a reprint, and it was very, very expensive. And not only that, we had to reassure some very unhappy Chinese diplomats on a book to do with diplomacy. So it was really an awkward situation. So you must always check that what's correct is correct, and always ask to see that final version. And if you're in the case of a publisher, because I've worked in publishing where I took the manuscript from the vetting stage right through to organising the book launch, if you are the publisher and you actually get the book in, always take out a range of sample copies and go through them to check they're correct before going ahead with any book launch. So my second tale is a bit about book launches actually. Highlights the need to examine a book from cover to cover. So ahead of any book launch, I'd always do that random check, printed copies. Received a book on peacekeeping in Southeast Asia. the cover had arrows on the front, but no background map of Southeast Asia. The arrows just went nowhere. It was totally out of context. So I'd seen the cover proof. I'd actually signed off on that as being accurate, and it had both the arrows and the map. So luckily, I actually sent it back to the printers, but I had to tell them that I had to get 350 copies reprinted in 2 days' time for a book launch, which couldn't be postponed. I had the Australian CDF, Chief of Defence Force, was launching the book in front of media, and the book was due to be handed out as a textbook to military personnel attending a staff officers course. So there was no way I could delay it, and they had to print. So it became rather a compromise issue where we had other printing that was going for them, and we said, well, that you can put that off, you can delay that, and go ahead and print this. And I find in the indexing world that the biggest word to learn is compromise. So basically there's a couple of my cautionary tales. So I guess there's an interesting one from The Economist. But you need to check the final proof from the publisher. The text should be the version you expect to see in that published book. You need to check the final proof of the cover artwork, and you need to get someone else to review the proofs as well. Check the detail, no matter whether the book is published in print or online, and see a sample before it's distributed. In the early session, actually it was the first session yesterday, someone, when asked about all these things to do with technical communicators and the words, someone in the audience said that one of the issues for technical communicators is that they're invisible. Well, likewise, indexing is a bit like that. And I believe indexers, like editors, should be acknowledged for the work they do. I'm often asked if I've actually ever turned down an index. I never have. But after reviewing a book before indexing, I have on occasion asked that my name not appear anywhere in it, which is actually not as uncommon as you might think. Some people you'll read, but it's just not formatted, or it has all these incorrect errors. And if you're just doing the indexing, and that's the only part of the process, you don't have any say in any other part, then sometimes it's your own reputation on the line in a way, or the reputation of the company you're working for, or in that case, or some academic area. So basically, so now we know the various types of index and how an index works. So what of the e-world? Well, you might see how an index is still relevant in a longer book, but here's an example again of that light index. You have to ask whether a light or average index is still relevant to the reader. Or are there other ways we can reach the information we want in an e-book? Well, to answer those questions, we just need to ask a few more questions. The first is, can an e-index include themes and concepts rather than just words? For example, in the printed copy of this book called The Shield of Achilles, War, Peace and the Course of History by Philip Bobbitt, which was actually quite popular a few years back, you find detailed entries that almost act as glossary definitions in reading like a Glindex. So this is the entry that it's got for market state, and it's a mouthful. Now, I'm a clear communicator. I work for Wright, so it's clear communications and plain language for me too. And that's not really that way, but anyway, it's a mouthful. It defines market state as the emerging constitutional order that promises to maximise the opportunity of its people, tending to privatise many state activities and making representative government more responsive to the market. And then you get the locators or page numbers. The other problem with this, just as an aside, the other problem with this index entry is that there is a thing called undifferentiated locators, and that is that you shouldn't have any more than around about 12 to 15 locators after an entry, and you can see that this has got sufficiently more than that. You should actually sub-entry them if you can. Otherwise, someone will go to that and they'll want to know, that's great, we've got the definition, but in what capacity is this book discussing market state? It just seems to be a catch-all for everything. So you can see how an index can help you when you sort of know what you want, but you aren't sure how to describe it. And if you want to know about people, here's the entry for Machiavelli from the same page. So that's an interesting one because it gives you more information than you'd expect and more than you would get from an e-index entry. So my second point is, can an e-index signal depth of coverage? So when you look at that entry, you know immediately that the first locator, 80, so right there, must have less information than the second locator, which is the range 85 to 88. And it also provides some context, more importantly, by listing some of the books by Machiavelli. So it's trying to place that also into context. And I guess third is, can an E-index provide a handy one-stop tally of particular points throughout a book? So if there are related themes, being able to see all the locators at a glance from the start can be of great help. In the book, it's from Australia and Cyber Warfare by Gary Waters, Des Ball and Ian Dudgeon, we can see all the details on warfare that the book covers. It also indexes notes that have relevant information. Basically, that's actually a book that I edited and indexed. But seeing only a few locators next to an entry can also be helpful. So if you're interested in following a particular sub-theme on a topic, but the book's index shows you only 1 or 2 page locators for that sub-theme, perhaps it's a clue you need to find a different book on the same topic that can offer you a different perspective. Like I say, I edited and indexed this, and this convergence of professions. It's actually better to separate the 2 tasks, but sometimes budgetary constraints mean one person must edit and index. So it pays to always, if you're in that position, to always have another person review your work. So working on this one actually raised another issue about indexing. It was, as I said, it's got 3 authors. Now, Gary Waters was basically, and both he and Ian Dudgeon were both government, and Des Ball an academic. So I came to call it my legato staccato book, because the academic wrote in languid prose, the policy analyst wrote in bullet points. So it's a series of basically unrelated topics, no doubt familiar to us all here. And despite differing approaches to layouts and subject matter, I had to craft the text in a way that made it seamless. And I had to make the index seamless. And the comment that was made about not changing the author's voice, particularly in the academic world, is true. Never try and do that. What you try and do it is basically, you don't want to show the index apart from the text, or even your edits apart. You don't want to show a different voice in the edits. But an effective index has to match the book's rhythm and tone, and so it's got to be in tune with the book. So if you have queries, you actually go back and you ask the authors, some of whom won't be at the same institution, or they'll be in different locations, which is a range of problems in its own, has its own issues. But you do need to check with them and just make sure that you haven't actually changed what they want to say in that book. So fourth, can an E-index draw you to other terms on a page? Well, Leonard Guttridge has put out a book called Ghosts of Cape Sabine, which is about an ill-fated Arctic expedition, and it's got an index entry called Arctic Moon in speech marks. Sounds intriguing. I mean, it does. It's just got that, and it's got a couple of page numbers. Sounds intriguing to lead you on your own pathway to discovery, but without any context, you might think that Arctic Moon just simply refers to how you view the moon from the Arctic. But when you actually go to page 76, you find out that it's actually a news sheet. It was fortnightly. Your eye is also drawn, more importantly, to other information on the page. So you're not seeing it out of context, such as the type of ads that appeared in it, and details about taking magnetic readings and how the US Coast Guard was involved. So there's a whole range of different issues that you see on a page, not purely the index entry that you're looking up. So in a similar way, I guess indexing is an effective way to group like information. So I guess fifth, can an E-index give a sense of the book's coverage? An E-index needs to be more than just a table of contents. That's what I was referring to before. Flipping the pages of a book can help you decide whether or not it's worth purchasing, and you can flip all the pages of the book, not just those pre-selected for you, as in the e-world. We've often seen that, which may be skewed towards a prospective sale. So no matter whether an index is light, average, scholarly or exhaustive, an index makes a book seem worthy of a read. And basically, this was a guy. Arthur Selm spent 20 years as the book review editor and columnist and feature and arts writer for the San Diego Union Tribune newspaper. And he said, a non-fiction book without an index has no heft. I pay it no attention. When I am deciding on whether to review or have a book reviewed, I check the index to get a good idea of what's covered in the book to help me decide. As with a book, we live in a packaged information age. We've seen how an index can help readers access information. Books that give readers more efficient ways to access what they need are books that are going to sell better. So if an index can offer all those advantages, why don't most ebooks have one? Well, after all, a well-designed e-index might make the ebook look smarter. But not being integral to the main story, an index is often the first thing to go. And it's usually discarded during the planning stage, the book's planning stages. It doesn't even get further than that. An e-index is also a search engine. It sort of helps you find a word, but it's not a decision engine. It doesn't actually help you analyse a topic or place a topic in context. So an e-index mightn't be able to give you the type of coverage or depth that you want. Complex indexing in the e-world is taking its first steps, but it faces significant hurdles. The first hurdle it's got to overcome is inaccurate page referencing. So a reader's ability to change the font size at a tap can constantly change page references. Some e-readers are trying to overcome this. And believe it or not, I'm going to follow on from what Karen mentioned yesterday when she gave you a session on ebooks. One example is the Kindle Paperwhite, which is new out, and shortly to come to these shores. It holds up to 1,100 books, and so the extra cost for printing indexing pages and the storage of a larger printed book with an index are no longer a problem. But more importantly, it actually matches the pages of a Kindle book to the text in the print book, by specifying the edition and identifying the correspondingly real page numbers. So it means you can read, reference and cite from the ebook at the same time someone else is reading, referencing and citing from a printed copy. That's an important breakthrough, not only if you want to source a quote or cite, but if, say you're in a book club and you've got a e-version and someone else has got the printed version, or if you're on a training course and the same thing applies. So it's accessibility. Of course, the Kindle Paperwhite allows you to bookmark and annotate. You can add notes to the text, like you can, and then edit, delete and export the notes. You can also highlight and clip the key passages. But it's got a couple of other useful features. Well, one's rather fun, depending on your point of view. The useful feature is Bing Translator, so it actually, it offers you can highlight a section and instantly translate it into Spanish or Japanese. But the other thing it's got for the time conscious or simply competitive among us is a fun feature is the time to read feature, which is basically personalised to your reading speed and constantly updates as your speed and reading habits change. So doing so means it can tell you how long you're going to take to finish a book or a chapter in a book, if you're busy timing yourself. So it's quite a handy little feature. Second hurdle to overcome is time-consuming formatting. So one example is Adobe's InDesign, because it strips out the index markers when it creates an EPUB file. You can insert the HTML anchor points manually, but it's time-consuming. So recent versions of InDesign are seeking to solve such problems in indexing, and I'm going to come to our conference next year because we've actually got one of the lead practitioners of this coming out from the States who's giving a workshop, a full-day workshop on the latest on indexing using InDesign. But it takes extra time and money to build an index that may only end up frustrating the reader instead of being useful. So for a comparison, we only just need to think about the iPhone Maps app of late. So when I was at the Australian National University and they started ePress, I moved the area I was in, which was Strategic and Defence Studies Centre, I moved their core publication book series to ePress. But creating the indexes was difficult. Essentially, the index in a book became a basic PDF version at that stage. And then they moved and transitioned through HTML, and now they're in EPUB. So it's easy to see why publishers forget about an index and instead see the search function as a reasonable substitute. But the problem with the search function is it's not able to differentiate, for instance, between two people named D. Smith. It's going to throw up all the D. Smiths. So others include a print index, but don't hyperlink the page references, or they hyperlink them to artificial page markers that may be several page views removed from the index term. So you've still got to do some searching on your own, especially and that also happens if it's in the reflowable format, which was mentioned yesterday. I'm going to do reflowable. So basically, the future of indexing is to think beyond how we program ebooks to recreate page-based indexing. We basically need a new approach. Everyone, book designers, indexers, publishers, and e-reading system manufacturers must think about the questions, like I raised earlier, of why do readers turn to an index? What's the value of an index? And then they need to match the answers to those questions with ways that screen-based publications can meet that need. So the answer isn't to snapshot a print index and turn each entry into a hyperlink. Instead, you want search index tools and indexes to work together, passing queries from one another as readers navigate their own range of questions. So one possible solution is to update the index, like I say, with those direct hyperlinks to the term originally referenced. The ebook basically then becomes a type of value add for the reader. If we don't use sort of like the Kindle Paperwhite solution, and the ebook can't sort of match the page numbers, then we need to consider radical ideas, such as creating a method of indexing that, dare I say, eliminates all page numbers. So I've created basically one. So you can see from this example that the numbers are incremental. First appearance, then second appearance in Chapter 1 is what it basically is, and then Chapter 2. But using that approach, you can lose information if the original index entry spans a range of page numbers. So if there was an issue and you wanted to check it out and it was on pages 2 to 4, that's not going to show you much because it's just going to show you individually incremental numbers. This one shows the index in a search result format with context. So this approach brings digital and useful together, where a small amount of context can steer your readers exactly where they want to go. That's quite handy. Here's another solution, basically. We've got a couple of things here. That one is actually from the Digital Book Index, which I'll come to a bit later. But here's that other solution. We can combine the indexes for multiple books by one author under a single index. So that's an entry for managers from what's called a mashed index by the indexing team at BIM Publishing in the States. It uses square brackets to show the identifiers for titles of books by one author. Mashed index of books can actually help you see, what I found is help you see the evolution of an author's ideas as they've written them throughout a space of 6 or 7 years, say. In this case, the actual online entries are accessed from a banner of alphabetical A to Z links at the top. So some mashed indexes show the paragraphs that the index entries refer to, basically because, and I quote from them, look inside or downloading chapter 1 just isn't enough. So they're looking at a range of different ways to make indexes effective for the author. You might also be forgiven for thinking that if the poor author wrote something in the year 2006 and they've written something now, that you might actually find stuff that's been repeated or that sort of side of things. But I think the benefits outweigh the negatives in this one. I think it's important to see, it's quite interesting to see how an author's thought or thinking has gone over the years. So it's quite interesting the way they've done that. And basically, sort of most full-time, sort of non-freelance indexes in New Zealand, as I said, are database indexes. And my presentation sort of focused on back-of-book indexing, so it's quite a narrow definition of index. But the digital book index has actually been going for over a decade. and I thought it might be quite useful to mention this because it's quite a good resource. It's a meta-index for major ebook sites and smaller specialised sites. It's got links to more than 165,000 full-text digital books from more than about 1,800 commercial and non-commercial publishers, universities and various private sites. More than 140,000 of them are available for free, so that's handy. It provides support for iPad, Kindle, Nook, a range of different applications, and it's got the entire online catalogue of certain science like Wiley into Science sitting on it as well if you're doing research. As another aside, someone yesterday in the audience asked the question, are there books in Braille at the ebook section? So I actually went and did some digging. The answer is actually yes. Believe it or not, in 2009, to mark the 200th birthday of Louis Braille, there was a push to create e-readers for readers of Braille. Samsung had actually already created Touch Messenger that featured Braille touchpad, but that was purely for text messaging. A group of researchers in Finland attempted to create pads using pulses of intense vibration, and this is similar, has moved on from there. But basically, here's the latest definition of a Braille ebook, and I've just taken it from Wikipedia, this one. A Braille ebook is a refreshable Braille display that uses electroactive polymers, rather than mechanical pins to raise Braille dots on a display. As of 2012, they exist only in concept design. Though not inherently inexpensive, believe it or not, due to the small scale of production, they just haven't been shown to be economical. But there seems to be a trend for people to think it's something that should happen. So I just thought I'd mention that one. Now, basically, in front of you on the final page, there's a thing in there about the DTTF. And in May 2011, the American Society for Indexing established the Digital Trends Task Force to influence the inclusion and use of indexes in ebooks. Your handout lists its mission, details, one main project on indexing, gives a timeline. Basically, the EPUB project's due to be tested, as you'll see there, it's basically early to mid-2013. In its EPUB 3 indexes charter, the task force notes that users of an EPUB index should be able to read or browse an index in full chapter-like format, quickly access index information in a search context, see index entries associated with a range of text, but the project's not covering how to use indexing tools. So anything from built-in modules and page layout and XML content management software to dedicated index preparation software isn't included. The project also won't cover how to order main headings and subheadings because they're pretty much aspects of how you create an index. It won't cover how to format and present the index because those obviously vary from writer to writer, and publishing houses will send you out, as they do for all authors, will send you out specific guidelines of how to submit an index. And it won't cover any low-level system functionality, so for fast lookup, reverse lookup, retrieval, anything like that. So there's a lot it won't cover, but basically it's sort of a first step into a brave new world in a way. So I guess today we've sort of seen how indexing is changing, but basically why, as technical communicators, should we care what happens to the often overlooked index at the back of a book? And is indexing coming to an end, or is there some sort of light at the end of the tunnel? Well, many of us already read and use printed books and manuals that have indexes. Indeed, we probably use them so regularly in this group that we actually don't pay them much attention. Indexes will sort of continue to provide readers with a doorway to the text. Whether they'll only be used for denser, lengthier and more impenetrable text remains to be seen. We just have to make sure that indexes and the indexing profession keep pace with changes in the publishing and technological landscape. And like I say, Neil James earlier spoke about the convergence of communication. It made me think that back to the days of when I first started in my first job, which was in a law firm. And basically I was introduced, my job description was word processor operator, or WP operator, which you don't see around that much in advertising anymore. And the first program I worked on was WordPerfect, yes, with all those lovely little commands you had to remember. And Then when I finally got to work at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre, my job initially was researcher, part-time librarian, editor, and then all of a sudden I discovered that over the course of about 4 years I had become a designer. I was designing book covers. I was doing every part of the process, from editing to proofreading, and indeed, like I say, I was also organising the book launch at the end. So for me, it's actually been a convergence of different types of profession into one, but also expanded the scope, my skill set. And I guess that's where it's heading. We all do need to work together on it, particularly in this area because of the E issue. And basically, over the past decade, we've seen how technology is basically levelling language. And even I come back to George Bernard Shaw, but he said an index is actually a great leveller. He said the index is a great leveller. I might agree. After indexing a biography, a former colleague rushed into my office to congratulate me on the quality of the index. It's superb, he said. I thought, this is great. Finally, an indexer getting thanked for their work. When does it ever happen? As you know, in sort of your profession, it's sort of unheralded. But I was curious to find out why he thought the index was so great. You know, what aspect of it did he like? Well, he said, I get 3 entries, but my former boss only gets 1, and I've waited 20-odd years for that. So I thought index is a leveller indeed. And it sort of also made me recall that the quote, "A man's dreams are an index to his greatness." But an index is also great, and we just need to make sure, basically, that it endures. So here are the details for the Indexing Companion, which is a book on indexing that I've found extremely useful. It's Australian, out of Australia. And when it comes to style manuals, etc., and the New Zealand Style Manual and the Australian Style Manual and the Chicago Manual of Style and all these other ones, I have actually found in my profession, I've found the most useful to be the Style Manual out of Australia for the Style Manual, and but also the Chicago Manual of Style, which is difficult to actually navigate your way through when you first look at it, but it's a terrific resource. And the other one is a book on design by David Whitbread, out of also Australian, which is a fantastic, and that's relatively new. And basically I've added in there links to companies that offer 3 different indexing software packages. Now, I actually had a demo of some of these, but I won't have time to go into all of this, but these are 3 of current and most popular in New Zealand is actually, as we did a survey, is actually Sky Index here. But all 3 of them have different ways of looking at indexing, and it just depends on your type of personality as to which one you find easier to use. I've also included a note about the Australian and New Zealand Society of Indexers, of which I'm a member, and I'm actually a committee member. A comment was made sort of yesterday about the possibility of TCANs having a mentoring system. ANZI's put one in place recently. It started by not charging for mentoring, but found, and this followed on from a conference I was at in Australia on editing, that mentoring, if you don't charge people to be mentored, then there's a higher likelihood they'll actually drop out and not continue to the end. They don't have anything vested in it, financially or otherwise. So ANZI gets a list of books from the Wellington City Library that the library considers might be useful to have an index. And then we assign a trainee indexer. So many of the indexes are for books focused on New Zealand history. Some indexes have been sold separate from the book. We were surprised we're actually selling indexes separate from the actual book. It's been time consuming, but it's also been an effective way to introduce indexes to indexing and to also help them achieve a level of competence. So ANZI's next conference is being held in New Zealand for the first time. It's in March 2013 in Wellington. A number of prominent speakers from New Zealand and overseas are confirmed, and some topics include converting legacy print books to ebooks with active indexes, which is pretty much where we're heading. The importance of the EPUB Index Charter for ebook indexing from the point of view of editors and publishers. The indexer and the editor assessing an index, and also indexing Maori and Asian names and terms. And we may even get into indexing things such as art and objects. That's another field again. So there's going to be a range of panel and roundtable discussions. There's obviously networking cocktails like here, Lord of the Rings tour, because a lot of the people coming from overseas seem to want it, a formal dinner at the Roxy Theatre, but there's also that pre-conference workshop on InDesign and indexing, and there's going to be conference workshops on practical indexing, Syndex and Sky Index. So if you're interested, contact me at meredith@write.co.nz. The keynote's titled Intrepid Indexing from the Sea to the Stars, and I created intrepid indexing because the sense of it I thought was the right word. Technology continues to adapt the way we work. It breaks down barriers between communities and boundaries between professions, and like technical communication and technical communicators, indexes and indexing, basically they need to be fearless. So that's pretty much a sum of what I've got. So I'm interested if anyone's got any questions or questions about the society or otherwise. I think they certainly will be. I actually think that's more a case, should I say, of demographics than anything else. I think traditionally everyone held up a book and there it was, and you went to the index and you found where you wanted to go. But young people coming through don't access information. Well, that's not the only way they access information. So I think you are going to see a change in the way people think about information, how they access it, how they communicate with others is part of that as well. And it's certainly going to, the problem is that I'm hoping that the two will run parallel, that the advent and the development of the technology will keep pace with our changing views of how we access information, which index is one. I'm not sure if it'll keep up pace. Yeah. And I bought my course. Just to show I'm not actually all back a book. I actually did bring my iPad in because I actually, like I say, have got an example of the book that I bought, which I thought would have this wonderful interactive index, and didn't. It's just basically just the text there, and runs all the page numbers, and it's virtually a total reprint of the book version. Every other aspect of the book is great. I mean, I love the aspect you can highlight a text and you don't have to run a highlighter pen and ruin a book and all those sorts of things, but the index is the one area that the book fails in. So it's a changing, like I say, a changing landscape, and it's just got to catch up. It has its own sort of terminology and that sort of thing. So if anyone's actually after a set of a glossary terms, let me know as well, because I've got one of those.